everyone, and welcome to the first class of this week, and we are going to talk about funerary anthropology. First, we need to know what is funerary anthropology. It is a subfield of the biological anthropology that studies the human remains in their archaeological contexts. This study is based in several informations, like the types of graves, number of individuals in the grave, the types of inhumations, and the position and orientation of the inhumation. And we are going to explore each of these topics in this class. Looking into all of this information about the funerary context of a burial is important because we are seeing the way that the population inhumed their individuals. And looking at the world of the dead, we can make assumptions about the world of the living. But we will talk more about this next week when we will apply all the knowledge from this course to understand how it can give us information about cultural heritage. There are several solutions for dealing with the death. They can be preserved by mummification, they can be hid but still worshipped, for example in graves, they can also be exhumed and displayed, for example when it's built a monument, and then there are also the reductions, but we'll talk more about this one later. And the solutions for the death depends on the times, societies, and social status. Starting with the types of graves, there are several types of graves, and it's possible to find stone graves, as you can see in this image, where the stones are covering the grave. There are also stone box graves, where the grave is made from stones, as you can see here, they are making like this box. And there are also unintentional mummifications, and in this image is a very well-known case of an unintentional mummification, that it is the Tolland man that was preserved in Denmark during the Iron Age. And I left you an article about mummies because we are not going to talk about them if you are interested. Other types of graves are, for example, a fossa, which is simply a depression in the ground, and it's the simplest way to bury a body, and you can see it here in this image where I'm pointing. Then there are also cysts, that is this structure here that usually only has one individual. And then there is also an hypogeum, that is an artificial grotto that is excavated to inhume individuals. And also it's possible to encounter skeletons without a funerary context. Some types of graves gives us information about the time that individuals were inhumed. For example, the cysts were frequent in the Bronze Age. So looking into the number of individuals, the graves can be considered individual when there is only one individual, then double when there are two individuals, triple when there are three individuals, and then multiple graves are the ones that have several individuals, usually ranging from 4 to 7. In this image, you can see that this grave has 4 individuals, one here, another in here, another here, and the last one in here. And finally, there are the collective graves, and in this type there is a large number of individuals, as you can see in this image. The collective burials can be simultaneous and not simultaneous. In the simultaneous, all the individuals are inhumed at the same moment. They are usually used when there is a need to bury a large number of individuals, for example in cases of wars and pandemics. And in the not simultaneous, the individuals aren't all buried at the same moment, so the grave is open when there is the need to inhume more individuals. In both of these types of collective burials, they represent the death of a population in a certain period of time. There are two types of inhumations, primary and secondary. In primary inhumations, the individuals are buried and kept in the place. For example, in the case of an excavation, in this type of inhumation, we are seeing the individual in its original place of burial, as you can see, for example, in this image. And in the case of a secondary inhumation, the individual is buried, and after a period of time, the bones are recovered, and then they can be reburied, or can be kept in another place. For example, in some recent cemeteries, after a certain time, the bones can be recovered and then they can be kept in a stone box in a cemetery, which are these structures in here in this image. Within the primary inhumation, there can be 4 different situations. The first is the in situ burials, and these are the easier ones to identify. In this type of burial, the skeleton is in its original place and position, as you can see here with this individual. You can see that all the skeleton is in articulation, which means that the bones that are supposed to articulate are in the right position. For example, if you look at the bones of the legs, they are articulating correctly. And then there are the reductions. In this case, the bones of the individual are grouped, but they still are in the place that they were originally buried. In this image here, you can see these bones, and this is the case of a reduction. In the case of the reutilizations, the same grave is used to inhum different individuals. The one in anatomical position is the last one that was buried. The bones of the other individuals are put aside, as you can see here in this image. This is the skeleton that is in articulation, and there is other bones that belong to other individuals. And in this case, this individual that is in articulation was the last one that was buried. And finally, the collective burials. Although there are many individuals in collective burials, these situations are still primary burial sites, because the skeletons are in its original place of burial. As you can see in this image, here, this is a collective burial, and it has a lot of bones. But if you look at all the legs of the individuals, you see that all of them are articulating, which means that these bones weren't moved to another place after they were buried. In the case of secondary inhumations, the more common are the ossuaries. In this situation, there is an intentional rearrangement of human remains, which implies the movement of some or all parts of the bodies from a temporary place of burial or exposure to their present resting place. This can cause loss of certain skeletal elements, particularly small bones like the ones from the hands and feet. There is always a period of time between death and the final burial place. The analysis of this type of inhumation is complex. Every bone that is possible to identify is divided, and then there are methods to estimate the minimum number of individuals. And this number is basically the lowest number of individuals that could be present in this context. It is always possible to be more, but never less than the minimum number. And in this image, you have an example of a big ossuary. You can see that these bones are like all on top of the other. Another example of a secondary burial can be cremations. When the cremation of the death wasn't done in an appropriate place, the crematory, some bone fragments could result from this act, like these ones that you can see in here. Together with the ashes, these bone fragments can be kept in urns, as you can see, for example, in this image. And the urns are actually the secondary place of inhumation. And it's possible to study bone fragments that result from cremations. It's really hard, but some fragments can be identified, and it's even possible to estimate temperature of the cremation, for example, through the color of the bones. For example, if the fragments are white, the temperature was above 600 degrees Celsius. If you are interested in this topic, I left you an article that explains more in detail the analysis of bones that were cremated. In the case of collective inhumations, it can be difficult to distinguish if it's a primary or a secondary inhumation. But there are several ways to do this. The first is by looking at the anatomical connections. There are labile joints and persistent joints. The labile are the ones that give in faster in the process of the decomposition of the body, are the ones that aren't subject of great biomechanical stress, or that are in areas with less muscle, for example, the phalanges. On the contrary, there are the persistent joints, and these are the ones that take longer to give in because they are subject of great biomechanical stress, or are areas with a lot of muscle. For example, the articulation of the femur with the hips. The presence of the labile joints in a burial is a good indicator that it's a primary inhumation, because they are sensitive, and if the skeleton was moved, these were probably lost. Also, in the case of collective burials, may appear in situ inhumations, and in these cases we note that it's a primary inhumation. Another way is by looking at the primary anatomical connections. If the bones that are supposed to be articulating are near each other and are articulating, it's a good indicator that it's a primary inhumation. Finally, on this class, we will talk about inhumation position. This is an important characteristic of a burial because it's often related to religion, social status, or culture. But again, we will talk more about this next week when we talk about cultural heritage. Human remains can be found in a supine position, that is the most common. In this case, there are a lot of variability in the position of the arms and less variability in the position of the legs. As you can see in both these images, both skeletons are in a supine position but have variations in the position of the arms and legs. The skeletons can also be found in a lateral decubitus, and it's important to note if it's a right or a left lateral decubitus. In this image you can see 4 skeletons, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and this one are both adults. And they are in a right lateral decubitus, in a left lateral decubitus. And this is actually an interesting burial found in Siberia. In this burial, here this one is a male individual, this is a female, and these are 2 non-adults. And they think that this may be a family, so I left you a link for this news if you're interested. The last 2 positions that the skeletons can be found are in a prone position, which is, for example, the skeleton here, which is very unusual, and the last is in a fetal position. It is similar to the lateral decubitus, but in the fetal position the skeleton is more closed, as you can see here in this image. In this case, it is also important to see if it's a right or a left fetal position. And then there is also the orientation. The orientation is basically seeing in which direction is the skeleton and or the grave. For example, the head is for north and the feet for south. And this arrow here that you see usually is pointing to the north. In the next class, we are going to talk about taphonomic factors. If you have any questions, please let me know.